I guess if someone were really trying to stabilize this, it would start with changing the structure of spending around Social Security, Medicare, and defense. You have to kind of go blank sheet of paper. Do we need 800 foreign military bases? Is that keeping us safer or no? And what's the cost of all that? That's that kind of thing. Then it's like, okay, so we have systematically kind of made our food less healthy, and now it's kind of ballooning into really high healthcare expenses on a per capita basis. If you look at Japan, I mean, they're going through a significant aging problem. They're much more aged than us, but they spend something like a third per capita on healthcare and get better outcomes.
Introducing our newest video, in which we dive deeply into the knowledge of renowned macro analyst Lyn Alden. Alden recently described the present and future direction of the U.S. economy using an eye-catching meme. Bus on a rail track with a train, Alden says the incoming train depicts fiscal power, while the bus reflects how markets have traded over the last 40 years, which has been characterized by monetary dominance. Since bank lending accounted for the majority of money creation during the previous 40 years, monetary policy has been successful. Interest rate adjustments by central banks, such as the Federal Reserve, might be used to control the economy. But according to Alden, a period of fiscal domination marked by massive debt and budget deficits has begun. As monetary interventions have been replaced by fiscal initiatives in this new age, central banks have fewer choices at their disposal to deal with economic issues. According to Alden, the indicators that were significant during the period of monetary domination are losing their significance. She has underlined in a number of interviews and blogs that the situation is almost out of control and that the only workable answer is to implement budget cuts, which is not a politically realistic one. Recently, Alden talked about how the U.S. economy is headed in an unsustainable direction in an interview with Anthony Scaramucci, the CEO of Skybridge Capital. Let's hear what Lyn Alden has to say.
During the pandemic, Powell called for more stimulus. So we kind of crossed the line where normally monetary policymakers don't, as a general rule, they don't really comment on fiscal policy. They try to be not kind of directly partisan. But he said, we've used a lot of our tools. There needs to be some fiscal support, right? So he crossed that line in that instance. What I would say now is that what we're seeing on the other side of it is that there's this kind of overflowing amount of fiscal hitting the market. But he's very reticent to comment on the fiscal side because he kind of goes back to the position of not really seeing that as his position. But I think at this point, a central banker, if they're trying to be kind of intellectually honest about this, is time to say it's hard to do any of my mandates when deficits are this structurally big. Because a central bank's tools are primarily designed around accelerating bank lending or decelerating bank lending. That's really what they're mostly geared toward. And we're in a fiscal dominant environment now, meaning that ongoing typical yearly fiscal deficits exceed the amount of new bank loan creation. And so those fiscal deficits are kind of a bigger impact on the economy in many ways than those bank loans. And then they can drive things like inflation. They can drive things like nominal GDP running hot with some of the inflationary consequences that come from that. And basically it's saying, look, I don't really have the tools to deal with what's happening there. And so if you want those mandates to be in any way, there has to be a fiscal response. And so right now it's kind of politically acceptable for central bankers or treasury officials to say, look, in the long run of time, yes, there's a fiscal issue, but then they always caveat by saying, we still have plenty of room. No one's going to admit that the actual road is kind of running into issues under their watch. And I think that there needs to be more transparency around that issue. So I basically would say, look, if you want me to be able to do my job, you need to rein in yours a little bit. Otherwise, I would resign and say, look, you put me in a position where I can't meet my mandate because I don't have the tools to meet my mandates. I guess if someone were really trying to stabilize this, it would start with changing the structure of spending around Social Security, Medicare, and defense. You have to kind of go blank sheet of paper. Do we need 800 foreign military bases? Is that keeping us safer or no? And what's the cost of all that? That's that kind of thing. Then it's like, okay, so we have systematically kind of made our food less healthy, and now it's kind of ballooning into really high healthcare expenses on a per capita basis. If you look at Japan, I mean, they're going through a significant aging problem. They're much more aged than us, but they spend something like a third per capita on healthcare and get better outcomes. So clearly we have a kind of a healthcare spending crisis.
Is that a polite way of saying that the Japanese are less fat than the Americans? Is that a polite way of saying it?
That is a big contributor to it. It's both its eating habits, but it's also we have a very processed food industry. So it's not like one group just their willpower gave way over a short period of time. It's the combination of human nature with this very processed kind of background structure that makes it all the hard choices are just really really easy to make. So it's our food, both individual decisions, food structure, the way we kind of structure healthcare payments, all of that results in basically just a completely ballooning healthcare expense. Then you can do things like mean test Social Security. I mean, there's ways you can at least try to get that back somewhat on the track. But the problem, I mean, the chance of any of this happening, especially all of it happening together, is exceptionally low. And so I think that's structurally, it's going to be very very hard for any politician, even well-meaning ones, to do that. And even if they get elected on that, probably as soon as they start enacting some of that, they would not win a second term.
The main point made by Lyn Alden is that irresponsible government borrowing and spending prevent central banks from carrying out their functions in an efficient manner. She maintains that in order to prevent an impending economic collapse, we must take immediate action on this matter. Even still, people in authority keep telling the public that everything is under control, even in the face of contradictory evidence. Jerome Powell, the chair of the Federal Reserve, has admitted that the U.S.'s financial trajectory is unsustainable. He said that it is evidently unsustainable since the federal government's debt is increasing more quickly than the rate of the economy. Powell suggests that lawmakers have a responsible conversation about correcting this budget mismatch. Even while Powell calls for adult conversation among public authorities, the seriousness of the problem is minimized in his remarks. Lyn Alden and other experts caution that the issue may be more serious than it first seems. Let's go back and hear Alden's thoughts on this important matter and what it implies for the U.S. economy going forward.
So the last time that developed markets ran into a debt crisis was really back in the 1940s. We also see emerging markets run into them today. And so combining, kind of what's happening mathematically today, what happened in the past, that gives us some view of what this kind of thing looks like. Obviously, technology is different, culture is different, there's all sorts of details. Basically, I would say that you start to get certain emerging market characteristics in even a developed country when you run into fiscal problems. So it's not like all the crisis happens at once. It's not like you have a pre-crisis and then a post-crisis. Instead, it tends to be a bunch of events that kind of culminate together. And so a key thing that it starts out with is the central bank losing control of its own balance sheet, that it's unable to ever kind of retain it back down, and they find themselves structurally monetizing fiscal debt, and always explaining why they're not really doing that, but their balance sheet's, kind of going up cycle by cycle anyway at a faster rate than it used to. And so that's kind of the first step. I would say that we've been in kind of that fiscal dominant situation since around 2019, ever since we had the repo crisis that probably most audience viewers aren't familiar with, but there was a kind of a financial plumbing issue in September 2019. I would say that kind of marks probably some of the earlier effects of fiscal dominance. And that wasn't a crisis in the sense that people didn't feel it, but you had that, and then you had the pandemic, and then you had the bank issue of 2023. You had the gilt crisis of late 2022. Over time, these things kind of add up. So basically, what it looks like is the difficulty of hitting a persistent 2% inflation target, which, by the way, that's only added recently. I mean, their definition of price stability, they define as 2% inflation. It doesn't have to be 2%. They could aim for 0, but they don't. But basically, their own target is 2%. The way they measure it, you get a challenge of ever kind of sustainably getting back there. You get money supply growth that is continuing to be significant, an inability to raise rates as much as they want to in the face of persistent inflation, the ineffectiveness of those rates, because again, bank lending is not the main issue. Fiscal deficits are the bigger component of the inflation that's happening. You see more protectionism. You see kind of like narratives, like in emerging markets, they'll say, look, it's not our fault the currency's problem, it's outside speculators are attacking it, or people are hoarding it, or you kind of put the blame on some outside entity or some small unpopular entity, maybe you kind of wealthy people in general, kind of a vague group, and you say, look, that's why our currency is weakening, the outsiders, the wealthy, whatever the case may be.
Scapegoat. You got to have a scapegoat.
Yeah.
Yep.
And I think basically you see years and years and years of that. Now, some of the more kind of acute crisis happened, for example, in the mid 2030s. the Social Security fund runs out, and so if that's not addressed in some way on either the spending or the revenue side, then basically people would only get a certain percentage of their expected benefits after that point. It would only be fed by current tax revenue rather than the existing fund. So you start to get these kind of mini crises along the way, but it doesn't just go from normal to Mad Max. It
Right.
basically, anyone who studies emerging markets sees like a slow kind of train of events.
So investors want to know this, and it's a very simplistic question, but I'm going to ask it. Are we going to be okay?
I think we'll be okay. I think you have to position yourself to be as okay as possible. I think you wanna prepare yourself, prepare your own situation, prepare your portfolio. In any sort of changing times, there are always some people that are okay and not okay. I mean that's true for any period of time. But basically, major changes in currency cycles are not the end of the world. They're just an end of how certain things existed for a number of decades, and then there's some sort of realignment, and then it's in place for another several decades. So it is, I would say it's disruptive, but there are multiple ways to be okay on the other side of it.
In her research, Lyn Alden provides a historical perspective on debt crises, pointing out that although developed markets haven't had one since the 1940s, developing nations are currently dealing with comparable issues. She emphasizes that even rich nations may display traits usually associated with developing economies during financial crises, when financial problems, instead of appearing as an abrupt catastrophe, this builds up over time as a result of several incidents. Alden claims that when a central bank loses control over its balance sheet and continuously expands it to monetize fiscal debt while downplaying these activities, that is a crucial signal. She contends that the US has entered a period of fiscal dominance since around 2019, starting with the repo crisis and made worse by later occurrences like the pandemic and problems in the banking system. Because of budget deficits fueling inflation, this age has witnessed ongoing difficulties reaching a 2% inflation objective, substantial money supply increase, and limited efficacy of interest rate changes. She advises people to get ready for shifting economic conditions with their own money and portfolios, even in the face of these obstacles. Although significant currency cycles may upend established rules, in her opinion, they also offer chances for adaptability and resilience. Alden concludes by pointing out that although economic changes are upsetting, there are a number of methods to deal with them and come out on top. Until next time, happy investing.